Yeah, my name is Tavares Strachan, and we're sitting in my studio in Midtown, New York. You know, I think I'm generally afraid of being afraid. I think that's the driver for my interest in exploration. Usually the thing that you see me doing, I'm profoundly afraid of. I think it's why before we started this interview, you asked me how the show was going, and I said I was a little bit scared about some elements of it, because these are things that are new, and I think there's a beautiful poetic relationship between fear and knowledge. And I think one's proximity to fear has a lot to do with their proximity to knowledge. I think there's something very magical about smallness or being raised in a small place. I think one of the things that starts to happen is you start to understand these micro networks of people, the community that relies on each other, how things get produced, how food gets serviced throughout the community, who's responsible for the cleanup, who's going to paint the houses, who's going to be the plumber. I think these networks are quite interesting, and I think you have immediate access to those networks from a very young age. I think there's an inherent sense of wonder in the limitation. I mean, I think the neighborhood I grew up in, I don't remember leaving the block for a good 4 years, after I was born. So that was my perspective of the world. It was a neighborhood called Baintown in Nassau, Bahamas. And so much of my worldview was being shaped in that small city block. I think it allowed for a certain level of imagination. And once I was able to find my way to the edges of the island, through work a little bit older and working with fishermen, I was able to start thinking about exploration and the stars and thinking about the possibilities for storytelling. There is so much work about how human beings are different, and I'm interested in how we're the same. And one of the ways in which we're profoundly the same is the fact that the way that we operate, our universal currency is storytelling. We tell each other stories to heal each other, to soothe each other, to get full, to be empty, to exercise, to understand one's mental and physical health, and to understand our place in the universe. So I think storytelling is essential to the human experience. And no matter where you're from, stories are going to ground you in some way. I think stories are the glue that holds this kind of human civilization together. I think without stories, I think we'd find it harder to relate to each other. I think memory is quite complex for me, mostly because the negotiations of how we understand the world are always in flux. I think what we know, how we find out what we know, is always changing. And so, in a way, memory could be a strength or it could be a weakness, right? If you look at it from the lens of processing information and trying to make kind of calculations and assertions about the way society is going to move. So much of dogma comes from memory, right? So much of how we understand the complexities of otherness and fear is about memory. I remember this bad thing happened to me by this particular subject at this particular time, therefore it might happen again. And the likelihood could be that that thing never happens to you ever again, and that has to do with memory. So I think it's interesting to think about memory from the standpoint of, conceptual decision making. What role is memory playing in your worldview, and how much of those memories are useful today. That we are living in quite interesting times. I think, for me, I think what's important is trying to find the inner child through one's process. I think my process in particular is a kind of search for my own inner child. And the works that I'm making, I think, is for that child. And I think if you speak to like a clinical psychologist about this idea, I think they would say that in a way we're all trying to find that inner child in the work that we're all doing. And a huge part of the success of that work is to do with this idea that there's some idea of truth or purity that is embedded in that child. So if we're trying to serve that inner child, then we kind of stay on target.